We've got a number of players in Asia right now. We've, of course, got Treasury Secretary for the Trump administration, Scott Bessent, whose clip you just heard from, referring to some of the moves made by Canadians as the moves of a hothead. We know that the president is there, and we know that our own prime minister is on this very important trip to Asia, seeking a new trade deal with Asian partners. Although this is day one of the ASEAN Summit in Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur, the main thing that's been preoccupying the Prime Minister and that delegation is fixing the negotiations with the Washington delegation. How things are moving on that front remains quite unclear. CBC's Rafi Boudjikanian has more from Kuala Lumpur.
12 hours after U.S. President Donald Trump's social media post threatening an additional 10% in tariffs on Canadian goods, Prime Minister Mark Carney addressed the situation with journalists, though he took no questions and said little he had not before.
The Government of Canada stands ready to build on the progress that we had been making in our negotiations or discussions with our American counterparts. We have a consistent focus in those discussions on doing the best deal for Canadian workers and their families. It is the sole responsibility of the Government of Canada to have those discussions.
There's no sense of when talks with Trump could resume, but Carney has been busy here, holding one-on-ones with the leaders of Vietnam, Laos, and the Philippines, with the goal of signing a free trade agreement with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations by the end of 2026 and doubling Canadian exports away from the U.S. over the course of the next decade. One business group, though, says it's key to restore talks with the Americans.
We've got to pull our own act together here if we're going to be able to have an opportunity to make progress. But I've said to the Prime Minister and the government very clearly, your first job is to stabilize the relationship with the United States of America.
With Carney's agenda on Monday largely taken up with meeting the Malaysian Prime Minister, speaking to Trump again may have to wait until both men are in South Korea later this week for the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit. Rafi Boudjikanian, CBC News, Kuala Lumpur.
Okay, let's dig deeper into this story with someone we often turn to for her expertise. We've got Vina Nadjibulla on the line. We turn to her for her expertise in foreign policy. Vina, good to see you. Thanks for making some time.
Thank you, Natasha.
Vina, I do want to talk to you about the Prime Minister's trip to Asia and how important this trade negotiating process will be there. But I do want to ask you about the news of the day, which is essentially how poorly, it seems, things are going between Ottawa and Washington, and with our imports into the United States being hit with an additional 10% tariff. How are you interpreting these moves?
Of course, it's another downturn in discussions with the U.S., but it's the Prime Minister saying we have to be able to do multiple things at once. Stabilizing trade discussions with the U.S. is job number one, but equally important is to diversify our trading relationships, our partnerships, including in Asia, and the Prime Minister is in Asia right now. And then, of course, the final job is to strengthen our economy here at home, and that requires investments. Again, Asia becomes critical to that as well. So I think while what's happening with the U.S. matters, we should also pay attention to what's going on in Asia right now. The Prime Minister is there. It's his first trip. And just in one day, he is making some difference already.
Oh, excellent. Okay, so and you're so right, because part of my frustration with this is that this is a very significant trip. If the country and this particular government is focusing on diversifying trade and getting the infrastructure to make that happen, once again, we have to focus on what's happening with Trump. So let's you and I focus on what's going on in Kuala Lumpur. You said that the Prime Minister has already made some important steps today. Talk to us about that. What have you seen so far?
Absolutely. So you're right that for us to be able to double our non-U.S. trade, we need to focus on Asia. Prime Minister met today with the leader of Vietnam, which is our largest trading partner in the region and also a member of CPTPP. He also met with prime ministers of Malaysia as well as president of Philippines. And of course, that's critical because he's trying to finalize the Canada-ASEAN free trade agreement. So Malaysia is the chair now and Philippines will be the chair next year. And Prime Minister Carney essentially wants to see that deal finalized as early as possible next year with Philippines as the partner. They also importantly agreed to expedite Canada-Philippines free trade negotiations. So in other words, there is a rapid desire to see more opportunities for Canadians to be able to do business in the region. But I think what's equally important, Natasha, is that the Prime Minister was able to raise Canada's profile, to position Canada as a leader that's interested in continuing rules-based trade, in continuing economic integration at a time when the US is pulling back, when China is also undermining rules-based trade. So smaller countries, Canada, Singapore, Malaysia, Japan, South Korea, all of these other non-US, non-China countries need to come together. And the Prime Minister is able to articulate what Canada brings to the table for those conversations. Canada was critical in shaping the world that no longer is, sort of the rules-based trading order that has been with us for the last 30 years. Now we need to be at the table and have discussions on what new multilateralism looks like and how Canada will be positioning itself, what Canada will be bringing to this new conversation.
That's so critical, Vina, because unfortunately, Canada is so much in the shadow of the United States. We don't think so because we're Canadians and we understand the distinction between the US and Canada. But when you're right next to this superpower, the global superpower, we often get ignored by international trading partners, whether it's the ASEANs or APEC, the 21 economy member group. So do you think that their perspective on us is shifting at all, or is it really still the United States that they are going to be preoccupied with?
I think you're absolutely right that oftentimes we get mistaken for the U.S. sort of as a smaller partner of the U.S. But the Prime Minister in his speeches, I mean, he's been there for one day and he's already given 2 speeches that have been shown both obviously around the world, but also to the audiences locally. He's positioned Canada as different from the U.S., Canada that still respects rules-based trade, that values inclusive and sustainable growth, Canada that's interested in expanding CPTPP, which is a rules-based trading bloc of Asian partners, but also connecting that kind of Asia grouping of free and rules-based trade with Europe and sort of positioning Canada as the bridge, which I think works really well given our geography and given the fact that we're both in a free trade agreement with Europe, but also members of CPTPP. He's also obviously talking about the strength of Canada, because at a time when all countries are trying to diversify, there's a lot of competition for the same resources, for attention of world leaders. So for the Prime Minister to be able to really calmly and confidently explain what Canada brings, that Canada is an energy superpower, that Canada is very good at mining, both in terms of investments, but also capabilities. So I think that's differentiating us at a time when we need to be much more visible and present on the global stage. But I think one final point, Natasha, is that this is also reminding Canadians that Asia matters. I think you're absolutely right that we're so focused on the US and to some degree also Europe. We just did a poll and 90% of Canadians say they don't know much about Malaysia or Singapore or Southeast Asia. So this trip is also putting the spotlight of how Asia is critical to Canada's economic prosperity.
Let me ask you about the fact that this is all so great in theory for the Canadian government, for the Canadian economy. Everyone's on board. Let's get these trade deals going. The infrastructure, Vina, I mean, are you following all of that? Do we have the infrastructure to make all of this happen, all these grand visions?
You're absolutely right. The short answer is no, not right now. For us to be able to get our energy products, our agri-food products to the global markets, to get them to Asia, we need a lot more infrastructure, more ports, railways, pipelines, all of that. And for that, we need investment. And the Prime Minister actually put a target. He said he wants to get $500 billion of additional investment into Canada. Well, we need obviously Asia investors. We need Australia, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, all of them to chip in for us to be able to meet that, because trade diversification only happens if we have the trade enabling infrastructure. So the objective of building a strong Canada and diversifying our partnerships work hand in hand, which is why it's so critical for the Prime Minister to not only focus on the US, although that's of course critical, but also find new partners and new relationships in Asia.
Vina, I'm being told we got to wrap it up. So let me just get this last one in quickly, if you don't mind, which is the issue of China. This is a huge economic superpower, one that we haven't had the best relations with in recent years. How does the Prime Minister manage that without compromising our principles and our national security?
Absolutely. A lot to watch on China because Prime Minister Carney wants to meet with President Xi on the margins of APEC. So I hope we'll have another conversation about that because that will be critical. But short answer is that we have to stabilize and improve our relationships with China. At the same time, we cannot become more strategically dependent on China. In other words, trade with Asia is more than just China, and trade with China has to be diversified. It can't just be in a couple of sectors. Our over-reliance on China for things like canola exports has to come to an end at the same time as we improve our relationship and have more dialogue. So yes, diversification and deepening of trade with Asia, but not necessarily further dependence on China.
Vina Nadjibulla, always great to get your time and your insights. Thank you so much.
Thank you.